Today, an indictment was unsealed.
U.S. Special Counsel Jack Smith announced the third indictment against Donald Trump in 4 months on Tuesday, this time arising from the former president's efforts to overturn his 2020 election defeat, which Smith said fueled the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol.
The attack on our nation's Capitol on January 6th, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people.
The 4-count indictment alleges Trump conspired to defraud the United States by preventing Congress from certifying President Joe Biden's victory and to deprive voters of their right to a fair election.
You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Prosecutors wrote that Trump knew his claims that the election was stolen were false, but repeated them anyway to, quote, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger and erode public faith in the administration of the election. Meanwhile, Trump leads a crowded field of Republican candidates as he campaigns to regain the presidency in 2024. In a statement, the Trump campaign said he has always followed the law and characterized the indictment as a political persecution reminiscent of Nazi Germany.
Our investigation of other individuals continues.
The grand jury indictment also alleges Trump conspired with 6 other individuals to overturn the 2020 election results. The co-conspirators were not named, but one of them appeared to describe former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark, the former head of the Civil Division who tried to get himself installed as Attorney General so he could launch voter fraud investigations in Georgia and other swing states. Another alleged co-conspirator appeared to describe Attorney John Eastman, who erroneously suggested that Vice President Mike Pence could object to certifying the election results. It all adds to the growing pile of legal woes Trump faces. Tuesday's indictment represented a second round of federal charges by Smith, who announced a separate 37-count indictment against Trump in July over his retention of classified documents. In March, Trump was indicted in New York over allegations he falsified business records related to a hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels. He has pleaded not guilty in both of those cases and has sought to portray the multiple prosecutions against him as part of a politically motivated witch hunt. Meanwhile, Trump faces a 4th criminal investigation by a county prosecutor in Georgia into accusations he sought to undo his 2020 election loss in that state. Trump was ordered to make an initial appearance in federal court in Washington over the special counsel's latest indictment on Thursday.
See a speedy trial.
Well, the speedy trial right is the defendant's right,
Correct.
not the government's right. So we're entitled to understand what the charges are. We're entitled to do our own investigation. What the president saw in the 2020 election was all these irregularities going on. Okay, affidavits, sworn testimony, examples of instances where the rules were changed in the middle of the game. He had every right to comment on that and act politically. You're entitled to believe and trust advice of counsel. You had one of the leading constitutional scholars in the United States, John Eastman, say to President Trump, this is a protocol that you can follow. It's legal. That eliminates criminal intent. How about he had 3.5 years? Why don't we make it equal? Okay. The bottom line is that they have 60 federal agents working on this, 60 lawyers, all kinds of government personnel, and we get this indictment and they want to go to trial in 90 days. Does that sound like justice to you?
January 6th was a tragic day, and I've spoken and written about it extensively. I have nothing to hide. By God's grace, I believe we did our duty that day, fulfilled the oath that I'd taken to the Constitution and to the American people. And the Constitution is quite clear about the role of the Vice President in the counting of electoral votes. It essentially says the Vice President presides over a joint session of Congress where the electoral votes that are certified by the states shall be opened and shall be counted. And irrespective of the indictment, I want the American people to know that I had no right to overturn the election. And then on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution. But I chose the Constitution, and I always will. And I really do believe that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States again. Now, with regard to the substance of the indictment, I've been very clear. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this. I had hoped that this issue and the judgment of the President's actions that day would be left to the American people. But now it's been brought in a criminal indictment, and I can't assess whether or not the government has the evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what they assert in the indictment. And the President's entitled to a presumption of innocence. But for my part, I want people to know that I had no right to overturn the election. And that what the President maintained that day, and frankly has said over and over again over the last 2.5 years, is completely false. And it's contrary to what our Constitution and the laws of this country provide. Our founders had just won a war against a king. And the last thing they would have done was vest unilateral authority in any one person to decide who would be the next president. I dismissed it out of hand, but sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear. And while I made my case to him of what I understood my oath of the Constitution to require, the president ultimately, continued to demand that I choose him over the Constitution. And so in this moment, irrespective of how this case plays out, I want the American people to know that I believe with all my heart that by God's grace I did my duty that day. And as I stand for the Republican nomination for president, I want them to know, whatever it means to me, I'll always stand on the Constitution of the United States of America. Look, our country is more important than any one man. Our Constitution is more important than any one man's career. And that's true of me, and that's true of the president, former president of the United States. So we're going to stand on the facts. We're going to stand by what happened that day, the stand that we took, and trust ourselves to the judgment of Republican voters and ultimately the American people. I'm very confident we're going to qualify for the first debate. Support continues to surge in. We haven't offered kickbacks or soccer tickets or gift cards. We're just accepting support at MikePence2024.com, and it's coming in strong. So I look forward to being in Milwaukee, and can't wait to have a debate about the future of the Republican Party, because elections are about the future.
Former President Donald Trump has just been indicted in connection with his efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Now, this is an episode in modern American history that's been the subject of public hearings and long-running investigations. For the first time, we now have criminal charges related to a 2-month effort by Trump and his allies to help him cling to power and to undo the results of the presidential election that he lost to Democrat Joe Biden. Here's what we know. This is an indictment that focuses on a very turbulent period between his November 2020 loss to Democrat Joe Biden and the January 6, 2021 riot at the Capitol. And this indictment alleges that Donald Trump lost the election and knew that he lost the election, but nonetheless for 2 months engaged in repeated scheme after scheme to work to overturn the results so that he could cling to power. It alleges that he enlisted a variety of aides and advisors in these different schemes and turned aside advice from other aides who said, you have to tell the truth, you lost. The indictment also includes some new details. It describes handwritten notes from former Vice President Mike Pence. It also says that Trump sought to exploit the chaos of January 6, 2021 by suggesting that the counting of electoral votes should be further delayed until everyone had cleared out of the building, which was again a way to ensure that he could remain in power. We know that Donald Trump is due in court on Thursday afternoon. He's going to be appearing before a judge, Tanya Chutkan, who has handled many cases involving January 6th rioters. She is known for being very tough on those defendants and for believing that January 6th was a disgraceful day in American democracy. And so that is not the most favorable judge in the courthouse that Trump could have drawn.
Everything else is a sideshow. This is center stage. This is American history. This is about whether American democracy was being usurped. Everything else about, did he take documents with him? Did he pay hush money to his mistress? That's possibly interesting to the tabloids. It's not a critical fact for American democracy. This is the main event, and it's been presented in a very tight, well-argued indictment by the special counsel. What stands out to me above all else is that this indictment, which is very well written, is aimed at one thing: expediting the possibility of a trial before the 24 election. So they have streamlined things. They have, first of all, not indicted the obvious co-conspirators. If you indict the co-conspirators, they will have issues, they will have lawyers, there will be appeals, and there will be delay. So that was the number one, and I think smart strategic decision. Number two, they have not charged the most controversial offenses. As you may recall, when the government prosecuted the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, they charged them with sedition. Sedition is a constitutionally complicated crime with all kinds of issues, and charging the president with sedition, possibly needing thereby to show some desire to use violence, all of that would have been very difficult to prove and would have made for serious appeals. So rather than hit him with the nuclear weapon of sedition, they have used lesser crimes like obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud the United States, which are fairly everyday offenses. They've been prosecuted successfully many times against the demonstrators who entered the Capitol. When we come to Washington, we have a city that is minority group is the majority, and we have a city in which most employees work for the government, and we're never happy with Donald Trump and his anti-government pose. So that he cut back on salaries and benefits. He is not liked by the governmental employees in Washington. I think you have probably the most favorable jurisdiction in the country if you're looking at whether the jury pool will like or be suspicious of the defendant. Okay, so those are differences. I am not saying that people vote according to their racial category, but I am saying that a jury pool is substantially different and substantially more favorable in Washington than in Florida. The obstruction of a governmental proceeding can be punished by up to 20 years. But it's unrealistic to think that any federal judge will sentence a 77-year-old man with no prior convictions and then arguably a blameless record of high governmental service. So I think if he got time, it would be a very short time, a symbolic year and a day, something like that. I don't think you're going to get 20-year sentences imposed by any judge. Now, that they have picked the judge by random assignment, and she's something of a firebrand. She's quite outspoken. There will probably be motions challenging her neutrality, but all she said, she has sentenced a number of the defendants, because there have been hundreds of these cases involving the individuals who entered the Capitol, and she has sentenced them saying this was an attempt to overthrow the government, this was very serious conduct, and we'll have to see if the American public realizes how serious misbehavior this was. The Fulton County District Attorney is hinting that she's going to indict Trump under the Georgia state RICO statute, and that she will name everybody So Rudy Giuliani and others may well get indicted in a giant circus trial down in Georgia. The problem with that kind of trial is it can't be over within even 6 months.
I keep trying to think of a word to describe this era in which we're living. And I keep coming up with bonkers, right? Like, this is just so wild, the fact that we're in this position. I mean, it's so wild that, in fact, the third criminal indictment is just sort of one more, right? Like, I saw the news hit yesterday. There's another indictment. Okay, here's another one. So the arraignment itself is just a pretty perfunctory experience. So, and frankly, the former president has done this a few times already now. So he knows how this is going to go. But he's going to be processed. He's going to be advised of the charges against him. He's going to enter a plea of not guilty. The judge may set out a very initial schedule, but this is the magistrate judge, not the district court judge, that's going to be handling the matter. So their job in this type of case, in a criminal proceeding at this point, is just to sort of be the initial gatekeeper for the matter and advise the defendant of the charges against them. The former president is very litigious. I mean, it's hard to see him resolving this in some way prior to trial, unless he is sort of willing to resolve, the other case, the documents case, and then, in turn, as a result of that, sort of these charges aren't continued. I mean, but it's hard to imagine a resolution that the former president would agree to. Most federal cases resolve before trial. A vast majority of them. It's a very small percentage that go to trial. But given sort of what's at stake here, who the defendant is here, these cases certainly seem to be heading towards trial. I mean, I think that even the timelines that are currently set out for the other cases that are charged are very ambitious. I don't think those timelines are going to hold. So the documents case, for instance, has this May trial date. It's hard to imagine that date holds, given sort of everything that has to happen between now and then. And frankly, the former president has a right to participate in his own defense, to prepare, to work with his lawyers, and to do that in a really fulsome way. And so I don't know how he does that with these three cases going on. And so it's not unusual for a federal case to really take, a number of years to resolve. And I don't think, I wouldn't be surprised if that happens here as well. This is an interesting case, as a sort of putting sort of both my former prosecutor hat on and my defense attorney hat on, because this case, in order to prove this case, the Justice Department has to sort of parade these witnesses through the courtroom, sort of very high-level government officials through the courtroom, and have them testify about these conversations that they had. I mean, in some instances, I think those conversations were recorded, or there's contemporaneous notes of those conversations, and there's going to be corroboration of those conversations, as I understand it. But sort of this is a trial, if this case were to go to trial, that is essentially high-level officials from the vice president on down testifying in federal court. I mean, so what that trial looks like is really mind-boggling. Yeah, I mean, so this is a little bit of a harder story to tell to the jury, right? So because at the beginning, you have to educate the jury about elections and election law and things like that. There's a lot of education of the jury that you need to do in the course of a trial like this. And then the trial itself, I think, is going to consist very largely of witness testimony, right? There's sometimes trials that are more heavily dependent on documents or recordings or emails or sort of tangible evidence, or other trials that are sort of more weighted towards witness testimony. And this is a case that is really weighted towards witness testimony. And so I am sort of envisioning in my head this very long, drawn out process where all of these high level folks are testifying and then cross-examined, in excruciating detail. And one of the hardest things, frankly, for witnesses to recall is conversations they've had, right? And so people's recollection of conversations, particularly significantly after the fact of that conversation, can vary over time. And so I think, I would anticipate some really active cross-examination of the witnesses who were testifying about conversations they had either with the former president or his co-conspirators or his agents.